told you a story a couple of weeks ago about my first spiritual renewal leave that I had taken when I took my 18-foot sailboat and sailed up the Delaware into the Chesapeake, and I was out on the boat by myself for a month. And as I was reading this scripture, I began to think about the preparations I made before I went. I remember planning that trip very carefully. I remember that I contacted a friend of mine who was still in the Coast Guard, a guy I had served with in the Coast Guard for a number of years. Actually, he used to work for me when I was in the Coast Guard. And he got me all the charts of the area where I was going, and I studied those charts carefully, made sure I knew where all the inlets were, where all the hazards might be, where all the shallows were in that area. And I studied those charts for hours. I purchased an extra anchor for the boat, just in case, some more anchor chain, anchor rode. I carefully chose the books I was taking for my spiritual renewal time. I wanted to make sure that it was a profitable time for me, that I would be able to read things that would inspire me and uplift me and renew my spirit. I made sure I had everything I needed to cook. I had a stove with extra propane. I had all the pots and the pans and everything that I would need to make sure that I was prepared. I got a menu together and outlined all the food I needed to take and made sure I was bringing stuff that would survive the trip with not needing a whole lot of ice, because I would only have ice for a limited time going out. And then again, whenever I could find a place to stop and get ice later, but there would be days upon days that I wouldn't be able to get ice. So I knew I was going to be gone for a month, load up all the groceries. I remember thinking I needed both a marine radio and a GPS. They would both be necessary for my safety. Not that I don't trust my navigational skills, but it's always good to have a GPS and a radio for when you do pick that brief. But anyhow, but I realized I couldn't afford both. I couldn't buy both. And one day I looked in the newspaper and I saw an advertisement at a local Cadillac dealer that said, "Free GPS with test drive, no strings attached." I said, "That'll work." So I went and drove a Cadillac, got a GPS, bought my marine radio. If you were to have looked in the hold of my sailboat, down where I was supposed to be sleeping, you would have seen that there was only room for me to kind of slip down into where I could sleep. I was probably overly prepared. I came back with a lot of food. I had a lot more than what I needed. How different was it for these disciples? Jesus said to them, he says, he orders them to take nothing for their journey except the staff. No bread, no bag, no money in their belts. Not even put on 2 tunics. And I thought about that. I guess that's just not me. I want to be prepared for everything. I want to be prepared for every contingency. If I'm getting ready to go on vacation, you can ask Linda. She goes crazy because I'm planning months in advance. She doesn't even know where she wants to go yet. I'm already planning. And I've got the maps out and I'm figuring everything out. I'll never forget our first vacation. I think it was our first vacation together after we got married. We didn't know each other very well. We were only 20. We'd been dating for a whole, 6 months at that point. And we got married and we're going on vacation, I guess that next summer. And we're going to go down to Virginia camping. And so I'm getting ready to break all the maps out and all the stuff. And she says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm getting ready to go. We need to make sure that we know exactly where we're going and how we get there." And she says, "It's Virginia. You just head south." I knew right then I was in trouble. That's how it was. You'll find it. And I got a sense that I don't know if the disciples were more like me or more like Linda. If they were like me, they were very anxious about the moment. The meeting in the parking lot after the meeting must have been, there's always a meeting in the parking lot after the meeting. You've never been on any church councils or anything. But anyway, so the church council told them where they're going. So the meeting in the parking lot, I can just hear James and John and Peter and the others talking, and like, what is he kidding? We're not supposed to take anything with us and just go out to these towns and depend on the goodwill of the people and no training, just go out and do this thing? And I thought about what Jesus God. The disciples had to have the same kind of thing. They had to know who the disciples were because they were dependent on Christ. They were dependent on God for the gifts that they had, for the things that they were doing. And I think the thing that Jesus was trying to teach them in this setting was you don't have to depend on all these resources you gather together. You don't have to be overly prepared. You just have to be faithful. That God will equip those who He calls. God will give us what we need to do what we're called to. My first preaching assignment when I was, my first full-time church was down in a little tiny town in Cumberland County called Port Norris. And I remember my first Sunday. Of course, I guess every pastor probably remembers their first Sunday in a full-time church. But I remember delivering the sermon and feeling, I also remember the number of hours I put in on that. I mean, the hours and hours I poured into getting ready for this first sermon. And I remember giving the sermon and feeling pretty good about it after the sermon was over, shaking people's hands as they were going out the door. And I got back to the parsonage and I sat down, and all of a sudden I got this cold sweat. And I started to think, you know what? I got to do that next week too. And the next week, and the next week. And what am I going to say? I just told them everything I know. most of the stuff that other people know that I just read real quick, I told them that too. You know, what am I going to do? And through that process, I learned to depend on God. And it's painful sometimes. Sometimes you want to be prepared. I always want to be prepared. So maybe it's just painful for me all the time. I always want to be prepared, but often as I study the Scripture and as I think about what I want to say, I really don't have a sense of where the message is going to go until a few minutes before the message goes. And that's a very uncomfortable feeling. But I think this is what one of the many lessons we can take from the Scripture is that God will equip when He calls us.